Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with a little book review for you guys today. For those of you who are just joining me here for the first time, I have made like a goal for the year to read one Greek retelling a month, and I decided to start a book club for it, mostly for accountability, because if I put it out there on the internet, then I have to do it. I gotta follow through. So, I have a book club, and it's like an informal book club. So you can join at any time, you can skip a month, you can do whatever. You're not obligated to be there all the time. But if you read the book, you can join in. And you just gotta send me a message on Instagram, and I'll add you to the chat, and you can join in the discussion there. And it's pretty fun. We had a really great discussion last month. We read Psyche and Eros, and it was a fantastic discussion. I'm really looking forward to the discussion on this book, and you'll see why in a second when I get into it. If you would like to join into the book club and you haven't already joined the book club, if you're already in, like, you guys are awesome and amazing, and I love it, and I keep looking forward to all of our discussions on bookish things. But if you would like to join, next month we will be reading The Daughters of Sparta by Claire Heywood. That's her name, Claire Heywood. So that'll be the book for next month. So if you want to pick that up and read along with us, we'll do the discussion usually at the end of the month or the beginning of the next month, just to give everybody time to finish the book. So there's plenty of time to join, plenty of time to read, and plenty of time to jump in. But right now, we're going to talk about Medusa Sisters. This book is by Lauren J.A. And you guys, I sort of have like an informal rating. I usually just make up a metric and go with that. And this one's going to be tough for me. I'm going to try to get through it. I don't think this is going to be as long as my previous reviews because, and I'll tell you why, because I'm only going to give this book like 2.5 snakeskins. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all, and I wanted to DNF and like not finish this book whatsoever. But I didn't. I finished it because accountability and also like the principle. I felt like maybe by the end of it I might like it better. I didn't. And arguably I had many problems with the ending, and it could have ended sooner. All those things, those are all my feelings. So I don't want to spend like an hour dunking on this like book, but I also don't want to spend an hour recapping the entire plot of this book either. So I'm not going to do that this time because I'm not in love with this. I'm just going to tell you guys some of my thoughts, and then I'm going to jump off here. But I want to start out by saying the things that are positive about this book that I did like. I liked the characters, particularly, not all of them, not all of them by any means, but particularly I liked one character, and I liked Steno, and that's this sister right here. So this book follows Euryale and Steno. They are the sisters of Medusa. That's Medusa in the background there, guys. And basically it follows them their entire lives all the way up until the end of the story. Obviously, that's how books end. And I found it really hard to find likable characters in this, which I think is part of what the author was going for, but I also feel like maybe she thought some characters were more likable than they actually were. But Steno to me was the only character that I was like, oh yeah, I really like Steno. And then like, there's a brief moment in Athens where they stay with Eurystheus and his wife, who is also an artist, and is actually the artist that everyone keeps talking about. Doesn't matter. But that couple, charming, lovely, fantastic people. Even their nephew, charming, lovely, fantastic, a little bit dumb. But otherwise, that's basically the characters that I liked in the story. I did think the book was well written, but confusingly written, and I'll get a little bit more into that. There's some stylistic choices in this book that I didn't like because I couldn't see the reason for them. I didn't understand the point behind them. This book was hard for me to read, so I'm going to just say like right off the top, because there wasn't any of this in the book or the audiobook or on like Amazon. I went to go check just to see if maybe somebody snuck it in there. Content warning. There were no trigger warnings, content warnings whatsoever in this book. So like I know, because I follow the classics and classical mythology, I know the story of Medusa. I didn't go into this blind as to like what was going to be there and how like upsetting the content could be. But what I didn't anticipate was that that content was going to be on the screen, so like on the page, so to speak. The like assault of Medusa is on the page in a very visceral and violent and like frankly really crass sort of way, that I did not appreciate because there was no warning to indicate that. So I anticipated that we would have to touch on that and that would be like a topic to cover in the story. I wasn't like expecting it not to be, especially because this is a tale about her sister's perspective on what happened to her. I didn't think there was going to be any like revisionist sort of history changing. There was a little bit, but I didn't expect there to be any like major significant changes to the story. In a way that would indicate that that wasn't going to happen, like that I wouldn't see it. I was not going in with like sunshine and daisies as my like mindset when I started reading, but I was not prepared for the graphic nature of the assault to be on the page as I'm reading. Like I was not prepared for that whatsoever. So if you do pick up this book out of curiosity, just be aware there's no content warnings anywhere on. There wasn't any content warnings on Audible or Amazon, and I have a friend who has a physical copy, and she looked and there's nothing in the book. And to me, that's like a major shortcoming, especially when you're covering something that's this sensitive of a topic. Just to give people a heads up and not just assume like, hey, you might know the mythology, because there's a lot of people who probably picked up this book who aren't super familiar with the story, and we're not going to be anticipating that happening. And even as a person who was anticipating that that was going to come up eventually, I was not prepared for how like graphic and violent it was. I expected it all to happen off the page because we don't need to do the graphic stuff to get the point across. I feel like, you know, that's sort of a thing. And I feel like a lot of like writing, a lot of conversation about books and novels and stuff and stories in general are moving away from the need to do that in a like a violent, visceral, in your face sort of way to get a story across. And it was just really surprising to see a very recently written novel do that on the page. So that was really upsetting, and it made me want to just stop reading. So I didn't. I finished it. I got past that and sort of processed that a little bit, but it took me a little bit to sort of come back to it. So just a heads up warning, if you have that in your history, it's going to be very upsetting. Other positive things. I wanted to get that out of the way before I started telling you guys the positive stuff, but I couldn't. I listened to this on Audible, and I will say that in the first probably third of the book, I found the narrators to be absolutely reprehensible. I really hated it. But as time went on, by the time I got to the like midway point of the story, the voices started to grow on me. And by the end of the book, I was like, okay, actually, these voices aren't bad. It's me making them bad with like my shitty attitude, because they really managed to encapsulate like the tone of the characters and get that across really well. So I do want to say like props to the voice actors for doing exactly what they're supposed to do. In the story, Steno is written very dryly, and also she has a more simplistic viewpoint and is very down to earth and matter of fact. And so her Audible voice actor, I don't know their names off the top of my head, she read it that way. She read it very even toned, very even keeled, very, very flat, but not emotionless, just really level and balanced. And that comes off as pretty dry when you're listening to it. So that's kind of what I struggled with at first, because I was like, oh gosh, I don't know if I can handle the whole book being like this. But then we got to Riley, who's got the whole middle child syndrome in full effect, and her character is very whiny and complaining, and like she's very self-centered and very self-focused, and she becomes very hard to relate to. But the voice actor also hit those notes very well, and I was like, oh no, this is like interminable. I cannot handle this because this is worse than dry, because it's actually kind of grating to listen to her. But then I was like, oh, that's the character. That's 100% the character. So the voice actors were playing to character. It took a little bit to grow on me, but by the end, I really enjoyed it. I really was like, okay, they're giving. They're absolutely giving for the narration of the book, and that was fantastic. Other positive things. I don't have anything. I guess like the story was fine. The writing to me was and so I guess a spoiler. If you're gonna read this book, leave now because I'm gonna start dumping spoilers. The writing to me had like there was some tone shifts, there was some narrative shifts from like first to third person, which was a little bit jarring. I feel like it was a stylistic choice over a purposeful choice, which is the part that sort of bugged me a little bit, but I got past that. The thing that drove me crazy, like absolutely crazy, and this is like more of a personal pet peeve than an actual like criticism of the text itself, is that at the beginning of every chapter was a snippet from like poetry by Eurystheus, the artist, that would tell you the theme of the particular chapter that you were about to read, so you could pretty much glean, especially once you get accustomed to the writer's like writing style, what was going to happen in that chapter at that time based on whatever quote was at the beginning of the chapter. And that's something that drives me crazy. I don't like when themes are told to me because I like to conclude my own theme and like come up with my own ideas and draw my own parallels and things like that. So not only being told the theme, but also I'm intelligent enough and literally competent enough to figure out what the theme of that is myself. Like, I don't need to be told. And it's kind of like one of my biggest pet peeves. That's why I don't like a lot of Christopher Nolan movies, because I don't like to be told the theme over and over and over throughout the course of the movie. Same thing here. I did not like being told the theme of each chapter as we went through it, and I didn't feel like it added anything. And like, I guess maybe it's a little bit ADHD, like pattern recognition, but I was able to figure out what was going to happen in that particular chapter based on what was the quote in the beginning, and that bothered me too, because now I was just spoiling it for myself. And I don't think it was the author's intention to do that. I think it was, just another stylistic choice, which is fine. But it didn't add anything to me. It actually took away from me. So that was like something that just drove me insane as I was reading the book. The story basically takes place from the time that the three sisters are conceived to Ceto, I think is their mother's name. It is a like minor deity, sea monster goddess, and her monster god husband. They have a bunch of monstrous children, and the three sisters are born basically normal, except that Steno has red eyes, Euryale has gold eyes, Medusa is born mortal. So both of these sisters are immortal, and then Medusa is mortal. And that's the only thing that they got from their monstrous, godlike parents. Basically they grow up with like sort of normalish monster girl childhoods, and then they go out into the world to like interact with mankind once mankind starts to develop, and the story follows them as they go from whatever kingdom Semele was in to Athens, and then eventually to the island that is like their final home. And it's fine. I actually really enjoyed like the beginning chapters as you're looking at like the development of mankind from Pandora's box to like them growing their own cities and stuff like that. I enjoyed that first part of the story a lot. And watching as these like immortal sisters grow up, because while Medusa is mortal, she does not have a mortal lifespan. So she lives just as long as her sisters, but it's just that the threat of death is always there for her. Like she can and will die eventually, but she grows up and lives alongside her sisters for like what I perceive to be like 1,000-ish years, but could have been like a couple hundred. I don't know how long it really was. I didn't pay that close attention to like the amount of time. It just felt like the dawn, like the age before the dawn of mankind, so maybe 1,000 years. I really enjoyed that part, and even the part where like they're interacting with the other gods and they're sort of seeing how things are, like seeing where they stand in the way of the world and what sets them apart from their monsterish like brethren, compared to the mortals that they are now beginning to interact with and learn from. And that part of the story was really interesting to me, and I really enjoyed it. And then when they finally actually go meet the mortals, and they end up staying in the city I cannot remember, with the Princess Emily and the king and queen there. They stay in the castle. There's like other princes and princesses there, but they stay in with Semele, who in mythology was Zeus's lover, who ends up getting pregnant and then tricked by Hera into having Zeus reveal his true form to her. So she dies while pregnant, and then Zeus takes the baby and puts it in his leg to hide it from Hera, and eventually the baby is born. But that baby becomes Dionysus. So she is the mother of Dionysus. They wrote this girl to be a little bit insufferable. Like, everyone treated her like she was the light of their lives and lit up the room, but she was really insufferable and just kind of like a little bit vapid and a little bit into herself, to the point where I was like, I don't like her either. Steno didn't really like her that much. Euryale didn't like all the attention that Medusa was getting from her, because Medusa was the only one that was like super pretty. So she was mortal but super pretty. Steno was like average looking, and Euryale was like also average looking, but could potentially be prettier if she took care of herself. So she spends her whole time with Semele learning like how to put on makeup and do her hair and all the things, so that she can pass herself off as prettier and well kept and all those things. And it turns out she was actually really beautiful the whole time. Steno was also beautiful in her own way, but sort of more in that like strict, high cheekboned, rigid sort of way. And she didn't really care about her appearance as much as her sisters did, so she didn't really take into that. She just sort of observed what was happening and was concerned for the safety of her sisters the entire time, because she's the oldest, so that was her whole thing, was making sure her sisters were safe and taken care of. And Euryale's whole thing was like, I'm not getting enough attention. How can I get more attention? I want Poseidon to be interested in me. And she was into Poseidon the whole time. They met prior to this when they interacted with the other gods, and Poseidon kind of flirted with her. And there was this whole thing. So Euryale's whole thing was making herself pretty enough to catch the attention of a god. And Medusa's whole thing was like learning. They made her like main trait being like really inquisitive and wanting to learn, which I thought was interesting. But then they also just made her like a little bit ditzy and a little bit like super naive for somebody who's lived just as long as her sisters. They're triplets. Like, they were all born at the same time, like in this order, but like, they're all the same age, but for some reason she never outgrows this like childish nature. And her face is also supposed to be, it's described as being like round-ish, kind of like a child's. So I think that was to more drive home like her innocent, virtuous, childlike charm and charisma, and her like childlike spirit, basically, to elaborate that she was like carefree and really outgoing and all the things that, you know, like children are, but in an adult, which made the following story, like following her story as she matures and then eventually ends up in these like sexual relationships, really uncomfortable, because they kept describing her as like having a round cherubic face and having like a childlike face and having a childlike nature and all those things. And I was like, this is weird. Why doesn't she look like a woman at any point in this time? Like, eventually you lose the baby fat, right? Like, that happens. But like, I don't know, like, the way that she was written made it really weird for me to like feel compassionate towards her, because I was like, you're grown, stop acting like a child. Why is she so childish if she's so grown? But then also, like, the way that they would describe her in that childlike nature then made every interaction like creepier, because I was like, ew. I don't like that. Eventually, Semele dies when Zeus reveals his true form, and all the things I told you about happen, but they don't know that when they leave. And they eventually end up in Athens, where they end up staying with just like a regular dude and his wife, because they were told to go seek out this guy because he's a friend of the king that they just left. And like, when they get there, Steno finally starts to develop her own personality. She realizes that she can be her own person, like, outside of being the caretaker of her sisters, which is great, fantastic character work. And she takes up an instrument. She starts to learn it from the wife, whose name I totally forgot, and I feel bad for forgetting that. Because the wife character was also really enjoyable. She was, like, a super artist, like, super creative, but also, like, an older woman, and she, like kind of took no shit, and then anytime like Steno would talk to her, she was like, why do you do that though? Like, you need better answers, you have to think harder. And so she really pushed Steno in a way that I was like, okay, I like this interaction, even though this section of the story really drags. So like, I liked the character work that was being done there. Riley spends her time trying to learn like about sex so that she can impress Poseidon, but not actually have sex because she's saving her virginity, because she realizes that's the only currency she has in this world is her virginity, and Poseidon wants it, so she's like saving it. So she tries to go out, and she ends up like going to a like a brothel and learning about sex by watching it like a creepy perv in a hole in a wall behind a tapestry. Which was a weird moment, but then I was like, I understand kind of what's happening, and I don't know if I'm like enjoying this character work, but it's a thing that's happening, and at least she's doing something. But I enjoyed the interaction with Steno and the musician the most in this section, even though I felt like this section sort of brought the story to a stop. And I guess that's maybe intentional, if I'm being really generous, because they were trying to give like a more dramatic moment when all the shit hits the fan and it breaks off, and then the new section of their life starts. So if I'm trying to give them credit, like, that's maybe why, but it really dragged through that section, and I was like, we could finish this. We could move ahead. Medusa, during this time that they're in Athens, ends up taking up residence as like an acolyte of the Temple of Athena, but like not directly an acolyte, but she spends a lot of her time there going back and forth, and then like sort of becoming enamored with the entire process. And this is fine, because in the mythology she was a priestess of Medusa, blah blah blah. She was a priestess of Athena, but in the story, the thing that they changed in the narrative, the big change that they made to characters, or the story itself, was that instead of being like an actual priestess of Athena, they made her Athena's secret lover. So Riley one day ends up coming across Athena and Medusa in the throes of the things that adults do. I don't want to get demonetized. So they don't tell you in the story as you're reading that it's Athena. It's just sort of implied that she has a lover. That Medusa has a lover. Which was good writing, because it left me being like, well, who was it the whole time? So I was genuinely intrigued to figure out who was the potential lover. But then what happens is that Riley blabs it to Poseidon, and that's when Poseidon's like, oh, I'm going to get revenge on my niece, Athena, by going to assault this person that is her favorite. And that's when you realize that the person that Riley saw with Medusa was Athena, and in fact Athena. And I didn't have any problems with that, like, story-wise. I was like, okay, that's fine. What I had a problem with was the absolute, like, character assassination of the goddess Athena in the aftermath of what followed. And I don't understand the motivation behind that, because after Poseidon assaults Medusa and leaves, after ripping out pieces of her hair, which was already upsetting on top of everything else that happened, Athena realizes that not only has her favorite person been, like, quote-unquote tainted by this interaction, but that her sisters managed to see some of it, so they know, like, about the relationship between her and Medusa. And for some reason, Athena's underneath the impression that if people find out that she had intercourse with a woman, they would no longer recognize her as a virgin goddess. So to keep that a secret, she curses Medusa and her sisters to become the Gorgons, to become these snake-headed women. And then to turn only men into stone, it says, but I don't think it's actually limited to men. More like men, and as in human, because it doesn't affect the gods at all. But, like, that part, not so weird to me. I was just like, okay, a little rough take, but, like, sure. It's the way and the wording of that interaction that goes down, where Athena doesn't just go like, hey, now that you've been ruined and I want to keep my secret safe, I'm going to curse you guys and send you on your way. It's the, like, I don't know how to say this on YouTube without getting in trouble. She uses some pretty vile language to victim blame Medusa for everything when the tables start to shift and she realizes that people might find out her secret. Because basically, Euryale shuts down and doesn't want to admit that she's at fault for telling Poseidon what happened. And Steno, realizing that Athena has, like, shifted emotionally in the course of this conversation, goes into, like, super defensive mode and threatens to tell Athena, like, not just Athena, she's gonna tell, Athena knows. She threatens to tell everybody about Athena's secret, so that's what prompts Athena to curse them all, and then to make it so that they can't interact with humans without causing them harm and turning them into stone, to essentially preserve her secret and preserve the myth at this point of her being a maiden goddess. And, like, this aspect to me is sort of strange because she sort of throws in this, like, little one line about how it's also protecting Medusa from, like, this ever happening to her again, which is super generous, by the way, so generous after everything. But, like, to me, that, like, that's, like, a throwaway. Like, that doesn't even matter because she's already called her a bunch of, like, really low-based names and, turned from being, like, her lover to her, like, getting vengeance upon her for daring to let herself be assaulted, which is disgusting. She's already made that shift, so, like, any addendum to that, like, ideology doesn't even matter because she already said all the quiet parts out loud, I guess. You know, she could have just kept that shit to herself and just been like, this is for your own protection, and cursed them and then just sent them on the way and then not had to worry about it. But instead, the way that Athena is written, she's like the villain now of the story. Like, her actions almost eclipse what Poseidon just did. Not that it, like, forgives or excuses Poseidon by any means. Poseidon is also written reprehensibly in the nature of this story. Although, like, the dynamic between him and Euryale is interesting. I'll touch on that in a second. But, it makes Athena the bigger bad than it does Poseidon by shifting all this focus and making her have such a visceral reaction to everything that's happening. And it was such a weird, like, assassination of character, because I feel like this could have been conveyed, like, her wanting to preserve her secret without making her deplorable. You know what I mean? And, like, I understand that in this story especially, they were really going out of the way to, like, perceive the gods as not being positive influences, especially in the way that they interact with mortals. So, like, that's how we got here. But, like, there's doing that and then this, which is, like, 10 steps past that point. Like, we already got the message clearly when she's rejected, and then there's a scene later on in the story where the hair that had been ripped from Medusa's head, someone notices that she has it tied around her wrist. Perseus notices that Athena has it tied around her wrist like some freaking twisted memento of her favorite, right? And it's never touched upon, it's never brought up again, and there's no resolution there. Like, Athena doesn't have to come to terms with that or anything like that. There's a little bit of resolution towards the end, like, retribution, I guess, the majority of which is off screen, so you never see Athena's reaction to it. And then when you know the original narrative, you're like, okay, well, that didn't actually have the impact that I think the author thinks it had. So I don't know. It's just a weird way to depict a goddess that is generally thought of as pretty positive, although I do recognize that a lot of mythology with Athena has her being kind of a jerk, which is fine, and she could have been depicted as kind of a jerk, but I think, like, this was really a tone-deaf way to do it, and didn't add anything to the conversation or, like, spark any sort of, like, ethical, I don't know, I don't even want to say debate, but, like, conversations, it didn't really do anything except for just plummet the character of Athena into detestability and overshadow the horrible, violent, like, assault that just happened, which is so crazy to me that this was written this way, and it was absolutely so upsetting that I was like, I can't read this anymore. And that's the point where I was like, I'm okay with not finishing this book. And then I remembered that I do this on my YouTube, and I have a book club, and they're going to want to talk about it, so I got to finish it. So when I came back to it, they end up going to an island. They stay there for a little bit. Medusa gets murdered by Perseus before she can give birth, like, while she's in labor, but knocked out by, like, drugs so that she's asleep. So that she can, like, rest in between contractions or whatever. She gets murdered by Perseus, and there's, like, a little bit of an aside for Perseus moments in the story where they try to go from, like, oh, he was a horrible asshole who murdered my sister in her sleep, to, like, oh, we're gonna tell you the story of this kid and how he's not really a horrible asshole. He's just a dumb boy doing dumb boy things and not asking any questions or being critical, and he's kind of a coward. Which doesn't matter. It didn't do anything. Those asides were just distractions from the main plot of the story, and also added to, like, the bloat of the book, because nothing changed. Like, my perception of Perseus didn't change. My perception of, like, his backstory didn't alter. Nothing was added or new or like a new twist on this tale. So I felt like, because the story is being told by the sisters and Steno is the main narrator, and she's the one who calls him the monster for, like, killing her sister while she's asleep, like, I feel like it just sort of was a counterpoint, like actually, to Steno's point about him being monstrous. It doesn't really matter what happened to Perseus or what he did to get there, because the story is being told from the perspective of her sisters, and her sisters are viewing him as a monster, as they rightly should, because he murdered their sister while she was in labor and asleep, not bothering anybody. And the way that the story goes, Medusa didn't actually kill anybody. Steno was the one who did it, because Steno took on the burden of having to help them escape Athens and, you know, take care of them. So she was the one who took all that on herself and became the only one to actually kill anybody by turning them to stone. So she was the monster, technically, in the way that, like, you would look at the story. Medusa was just an innocent victim. Euryale was a victim, less innocent, more victim. Well, not more victim, but you know what I mean, like, comparatively. She was a victim versus the innocent victim. And, like, it was just a weird offshoot that didn't enhance my like, enjoyment of the story whatsoever. And there wasn't any, like, chapters from Perseus's perspective. Just like, oh, look, he's just a kid, and here's a little bit about him, and, oh, no, he made stupid kid choices, which is fine. And if we were telling, like, a Perseus story, that would be fine, but we're not telling his story. We're telling the sister story and how they're viewing the world in regards to how it treated them and their sister, Medusa. Circling back to Medusa a bit, like, before she dies in the story, what I thought was strange, too, about her relationship with Athena is that there's never a moment where they really reconcile that. Like, they kind of point out that, like, oh yeah, we figured out that you liked women based on how much you, like, missed and were upset about, like, Semele. But they never circle back to the extreme, like, shift in power dynamic between Athena and Medusa. And there's even a little bit where Euryale encounters someone who used to be, like, Athena's lover before Medusa came around. And the punishment that this former lover got when she fell out of favor was to have her tongue removed. So she ends up having to work in this brothel and ends up taking her own life because she's just so, like, depressed and torn up over everything that's happened to her. And you realize that Athena is the person who did this to her when you finally discover who this, like, mystery god that Medusa has been fraternizing with. And for me, like, the power dynamic and the unbalance of that is upsetting, but also, like, never discussed. Like, nobody touches on that. Nobody touches on the fact that this goddess is essentially preying on the young women who come to her temple to become priestesses or, like, worship her or venerate her. And then when they no longer have her favor or outlive their usefulness, she is silencing them so that they can't tell anybody about her story, because at this time most women can't read and write. So there's no way for them to pass this along. Which is gross predatory behavior, and on the same level as the other gods that are depicted in the story. So, like, again, I was like, wow, that's such a hot take. It's such a harsh criticism of this goddess who, like, sure, you could say that's the case, and you can make an argument for, like, feminism in the sense that women can also do deplorable bad things, but there's other ways to do it without being, like, dropping to that level. Especially when you already have gods in the story who are, like, sexually harassing people. So you don't need to make everybody a harasser in the same level, and you don't need to make it a weird thing. Like, I think it's a little less egregious because by this point Medusa's lived for at least 100 years. And she's also a minor deity, so she's in the same pantheon. She's been to Olympus, she's seen all the other gods. Like, you know, she's maybe not on the same level as one of the 12 Olympians, but she's there with the other gods and goddesses, so, like, at least she's in the same playing field. But in regards to the interaction with the humans, the dynamic, the power imbalance is even greater. So, like, that's wild to me that this was, like, not covered or, like, brought up again at any point. Like, they just sort of move right through, and then there's a minor discussion on, like, abortion, which doesn't add anything because they decide to keep the baby, and turns out the baby is a giant and a Pegasus. If you've read the mythology, it's there. And then they cast these children out. Like, Steno's like, get the fuck off the island as soon as they're born, and they leave, and, you know, they go to do their various adventures, because the sisters are so torn up with grief over the loss of Medusa that they can't, like, even conceive of trying to take care of these, like, essentially bastard children, because they're the children of her assaulter. Like, they don't want this person around. And then they sort of exist for a time being. And then Euryale makes a very weird choice, but I have a hard time thinking of it as a bad choice, so much as it's just a very tone-deaf choice. And I think I kind of understand what they're going for. At least I put my own conjecture on that. But Euryale decides after some time that she's going to wait out for Poseidon. And when she finally sees Poseidon, like, they've been flirting the entire time this book has been going on, up until the assault of Medusa. And then she cuts him off and doesn't, like, want to interact with him the whole time. But he's, like, been holding a torch for her the whole time. So Poseidon has always been into Euryale since they first met at a party on Olympus. And she realizes at this point, when she's finally talking to him again, now that she's seen his true colors and he's been, like, demystified, and he's no longer, like, the sparkly god that she thought was maybe going to leave his wife and marry her instead. Like, she very naively looks at, like, her relationship with the god that way, and then realizes that's not going to be the case. And then after she has that conclusion, she comes to the conclusion that, like, yeah, they would be really good together, but they're also terrible for each other. And she finally can see him for what he is, sees, like, his desperate craving need for her to, like, corrupt her, and, like, he wants to get his fingers on her, and she knows that, and she uses that to her advantage, because Euryale has decided that because she couldn't be useful to her sister Medusa and failed on all accounts, all the way up to the end, like, she was the one watching over her when Perseus came and slayed her. Basically, Euryale has failed her sister at every point in time, that she's decided that she's going to do the only positive thing she can, but also get hers at the same time, and get exactly what she thinks she deserves, or what she's always wanted, which is a family that she can call her own, like one that she's sort of over. And so she decides to hook up with Poseidon and have a baby. And to me, that's sort of a maybe, like, the way that I read that was sort of reclaiming her own narrative, reclaiming her power over this man that absolutely devastated her family, taking charge of her own destiny instead of being, like, a passerby in it. And that's just me being very generous to this narrative, because I could not understand the motivation for why she would. So this is what I sort of inferred from that, and maybe is kind of what the author intended. But that causes a rift between her and Steno. So for a while they don't talk until Steno realizes that the baby might also be mortal in the way that Medusa was, and then all of a sudden they come back together. It's a very sweet moment in the book where they realize that, like, they're still sisters and they can resolve any issue, like they can overlook those issues in order to help each other and come back together and, you know, express their love with each other. And it was a pretty endearing moment in the book. She ends up having her baby. The baby is mortal. It's Orion. They raise him together. They co-parent. And it's a very sweet little ending to the story. But by this point in the story, I was done with the story. Not just like on the emotionally drained level of like, I hate this book and I would like it to end. But like the book should have ended like a chapter or two after Medusa died, because that was the big action of the story. And I didn't really feel like anything else that came after added to the story in a way that was like super meaningful or necessary. But it didn't like detract like some of the other things, like the Perseus chapters seemed to detract because they drug down the pace of the story. But the ending didn't drag anything down. It just took forever. And I was like, I am done. I'm ready to go. Like, it's time to leave the party. I've learned all I can from this. Eventually, Orion goes on his own misadventures and ends up with some, like, accidents, and Steno goes into, like, warrior avenging auntie mode and goes out and saves Orion, only for him to eventually die anyways, sacrificing himself to save a goddess, which is endearing. And then he ends up becoming the constellation Orion's Belt, and his dog becomes the constellation Sirius, and the scorpion that kills him also becomes the constellation Scorpio. So a lot of constellations were made, and once he gets up in the stars, Euryale's like, alright, that's it, that's my entire legacy, that's everything I have to offer. So she joins the spirit of Medusa in the sea. They return to the sea, which is where their mother and father come from, because they are sea monsters. And Steno is basically left by herself to explore her own life and her own divinity and everything, the course of her actions after that. And that's when the story ends. It's like, okay, so that's the whole story. That's everything that happened. And I really feel like they could have been like speed mode through that little ending. Because it took its time. It took its time. It came about 3/4 of the way into the book, and it stayed the entire last quarter, and it wasn't bad, but it wasn't adding anything that was substantial enough for me to be like, oh, I see, what an interesting takeaway. And maybe just because I couldn't understand Euryale's motivation, and I already was like, I know Steno's characterization, I get it, she's cool. The Gorgons have the snake heads, but they also have wings. Steno learns to fly. She's the only one who learns to fly, which was maddening to me, because I was like, what are you doing? Somebody else learned to fly. Granted, Medusa didn't learn to fly because she was pregnant at the time, but like Euryale never learns to fly, so she's just stuck on that island, excuse me, the entire time. And then she just goes into the sea and she fucks off and dies, and that's the end of the story. So yeah, just overall, like, this was a very unsatisfying book with a lot of choices that were strange to me, that didn't make any sense to me narratively, and I couldn't, I just couldn't wrap my head around some of the choices that the author made. Not to say that, like, I think this was poorly written, because I found the writing engaging. Like, the story kept me there the entire time. The author writes well, but like the choices that were made periodically throughout the book made it so that I found everyone we met subsequently to be unlikable, and then progressively more unlikable as the story went on, and in some cases just absolutely heinous, to the point where I was like, wow, that's so off-putting, because they're not typically or like specifically mentioned to be the villains of the story. Or they don't need to be this level of villainous to come across as villainous, you know what I mean? Like, this isn't that type of narrative, because it's a more feminist retelling of a story through the lenses of people who are experiencing the bad things that happen to a person they care about a lot. And I don't know, there's just a lot of interesting things to take away. I don't know if I would recommend this to anybody, especially because there wasn't a trigger warning, and I feel like I'd have to give someone like a 10-minute talking to about all the content in here and how it's just sort of casually brushed over in a way that doesn't enhance the plot. Like, it's so strange to me to have something that graphic and visceral, but then not to be like, let's dwell on it, let's the characters like converse about it a little bit or confront that it's an issue or anything like that. There wasn't anything meaningful or substantive like that. It was just sort of mentioned a couple times that, like, yeah, it was a really violent occurrence, and that was it. And that was just really deeply unsatisfying for something that was so troubling and upsetting. And I don't know. I don't want to dunk on this book forever. I feel like I've dunked on it enough. Probably longer than I intended to, but I got food in the middle, so I lost my train of thought, and I had to come back and pick it up again, and it got longer, which is the nature of things. But yeah, you guys, let me know if you've read this book, what you think in the comments below, if you're going to check it out, or if this is the type of book you would check out, because I would be genuinely interested if this struck your curiosity in some kind of way and you wanted to pick it up, on what your perceptions were, or if you feel the same way. And I guess, again, if you would like to join the book club, we're reading Daughters of Sparta, which I hope will be a delightful palate cleanser, even though I know that they're doomed. Hopefully it won't be as hard to get through as this book was. I really wanted to like this book because I really love the mythology of Medusa. I also love the retellings and the sort of the reclaiming of the narrative, as well as sort of the shifting of the idea that the snakes, like the snake hair, was a punishment to it's actually a protection because something really bad happened to her, so this is to protect her from people who would harm her. I love that shifting of narrative. I love when, like, old stories are reclaimed for modern times. Whether it's blah, 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 words are really hard. Whether it's necessarily true or not in the mythology, I do like the reclaiming and then the retelling through modern lenses of things, which is why I chose to do Greek retellings as my book to read for the year. I might do like fairy tale retellings next year. I've already started adding stuff to my wish list for that, so that might come up next year if I decide to do this again. But I have been really enjoying the book club, so I am very interested in like getting into the conversation on this one in particular, because it might just be me that feels this way. Like I don't particularly know how everybody else in the book club feels about it yet, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I'm curious to see if other people felt the same way, or if it's, you know, just me reading into it personally. I'm looking forward to that discussion, and if you would like to join in, you're welcome to. If you've read the book, just let me know. Send me a message on Instagram, and I will add you to the group chat. And then, if you have not read the book but would like to join in the book club, pick up Daughters of Sparta. We're doing that next month. And I'm going to get out of here, guys. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end of this video. That is longer than I intended it to be, but not as long as previous videos have been, because I don't want to shit on something forever, because I know the author worked really hard. Writers work really hard on their works, and I think it's okay to be critical and to have discourse about things that maybe you perceived as negative, but not to just sit here and be like, this was a piece of shit because of XYZ, and it's not constructive, and I don't have any reasoning for it. I do that with my friends in private, and I will continue to do so. But as far as like giving an honest review, this is how I felt about it, and those were the things that like set me off, and then there were things that I liked and enjoyed about the book. A lot of questions. It left me with a lot of questions, particularly that in the story, Euryale has one snake, Steno has 3, and Medusa has a head full of them, and there's not a reason for that. It's just depicted that way. But also, interestingly, now that I'm just in my final ramblings, in some of the mythology that I understand, Steno and Euryale were always monstrous, like they always had snake hair and wings, and Medusa was born normal, in the sense that she was born mortal, and the curse makes her like her sisters. And there's other mythology that says that she wasn't actually their sisters, just she was turned into creatures like them, so that's why she goes to live with Steno and Euryale. But there's not a lot of evidence about Steno and Euryale. Like, there's not a lot going on in the mythology itself to really indicate any of those points very strongly. Those are just different versions of that concept, taken from little bits and pieces here and there. So interesting choices to make all of them look normal and then turn them into monsters together collectively. I'm not mad about that choice at all. I think that was a good idea, so that they could all have the same lived experience and all experience the same loss of like identity and self and their perceived beauty and things like that, were good, but that conversation also wasn't very long in the book. Riley has a small moment about it, and that's kind of it. Steno just accepts it immediately because she has to. She has to be the competent one, which is like the tragedy of the older sibling, is that she has to take care of her younger siblings, and nobody else will, so she's the one who ends up in that parentified role. But yeah, that's it. That's all I have to say about this book. I'm going to get out of here. I appreciate your faces, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Until then, happy crafting. Bye!